During the 1930s, in the midst of a scene marked by political polarization, a deep economic crisis, and heavy uncertainty due to a war that was drawing ever closer, the European continent witnessed the rise of various ideologies from all tendencies. Most of them made the same promises to end all national troubles and to give hope once again to the tormented European people. However, from all that amalgam of parties and political groups, the so-called Rexist movement would stand out, led by a young journalist named León. Degrelle, who was influenced by ideologies ranging from conservative Catholicism to German National Socialism. It is part of the wave of political transformations that challenged the established order at that time. Thus, Degrelle, who had a strong personality, lived a long but also controversial life in defense of his ideals and what he considered best for Europe's future, facing multiple accusations and ultimately ending up in exile. Join us today to learn about his unique story. My name is Alejandro Andrade. This is the New Encyclopedia. And before we start today's story, I want to invite you to support our channel. If you like our content, subscribe, give this video a like, turn on the notification bell, and share it with those who enjoy it. Learning about history, I also invite you to follow us on Instagram, where we share exclusive content and previews of new documentaries. And finally, you can leave us your opinions and thoughts in the comments section. We always read them and take your suggestions into account for future research. And now, without further ado, let's begin with today's story. León Degrelle was born on June 15, 1906, at 29 College Street in Boulogne, a small Belgian town with only about 3,000 inhabitants located near the French border. The Degrelle family was middle class and had fled France because of the anti-clerical policies of the French Third Republic. Father Edouard Degrelle, of French origin, worked as a brewer and had been a permanent deputy of that region in the ranks of the influential Catholic Party of Belgium. This circumstance meant that from his childhood, political struggle was a constant part of young León's education. On his mother's side, his grandfather, Pierre Jules, had also been a prominent figure, serving as both a politician and a doctor in La Roche. In addition to being a fervent defender of classical European literature, he was even a founding member of the newspaper L'Avenir du Luxembourg. Years later, at 18, Degrelle published his first literary work in this same publication on November 2nd, 1925. During his youth, like many other Belgian boys of his time, Degrelle, he completed his primary and secondary studies at Jesuit institutions and later studied at the Catholic University of Leuven. During this period, Degrelle came into contact with the most select members of the Catholic intellectual elite of the time, being ideologically influenced by figures such as the French thinker Charles Maurras. In turn, due to his early intelligence and remarkable charisma, the religious hierarchies of the university quickly took notice of him. Thus, Degrelle became close to Monsignor Picard, a clergyman who was in charge of the youth of the Catholic Action Movement, an important political force of the time, present in several European countries, whose goal was the defense of the faith and Catholic values. In the face of the anti-clerical regimes in each of the countries where they operated, such as France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and Belgium itself, being close to these ideas gives him a privileged view of the power dynamics and organization within the Belgian Catholic structures. A very important fact from this early period of León is his well-known trip to Mexico as a correspondent for the newspaper Christus Rex to cover, under a double identity, the so-called Cristero War, which took place between 1926 and 1929. This was a conflict between the so-called Cristero army, supported by the Holy See, and the Mexican government of Plutarco, Elias Calles, supported by the United States, Due to the restrictions imposed by the government on the church and the Catholic religion, which was practiced by the vast majority of the population, it generated a rapid response, a discontent that led to a civil war, which drew the attention of the whole world, including the attention of Belgian Catholics during the Cristero conflict, who, because of their strong Catholic beliefs, fervently collaborated with the side. Cristero. Events like the Cristeros' war cry, "Long live Christ the King and Holy Mary of Guadalupe," and the impact of their presence. Degrelle was deeply affected by the capture and execution of several of them, revealing a connection with movements of religious and militant fervor that would resonate in his own political path. Thanks to all these experiences, León would write a book several years later called My Adventures in Mexico, where he recounts his experiences, such as visiting the cities where there was the greatest conflict, participating in several clandestine religious ceremonies, and even how he managed to infiltrate rallies of the Elias Calles government. After a long time in Mexico, in 1934, he returned to his native Belgium, bringing with him an estimated 75 kilos of archives to document the history of what happened to the Mexican Catholic faithful. León, his own path. All these experiences of early political struggle and conflict gave León the motivation to create his own political group and thus take his first steps in active militancy. Europe. So León Degrelle, only 28 years old. In 1934, with a bold vision and an entrepreneurial spirit, he founded the publishing house Ediciones Rex, whose name refers to Christus Rex in Latin, which translates to Christ the King in English. In a surprisingly short period of time, Degrelle demonstrates an exceptional ability to breathe life into the new project, achieving resounding success with print runs of copies. This triumph is more than an editorial feat. It signals a larger ambition. The publishing house, which produced a newspaper of the same name, becomes the platform from which Degrelle, electrified by his experience in Mexico, begins to mobilize and sympathize with the latent forces in the Belgian Catholic Party, seeking a more determined commitment to the ideals of that party. However, the year after his arrival, that is, in 1935, an event occurs that marks a before and after in the life of our protagonist. The energy and zeal of Grelle, along with the growing wave of young people who identified as Rexists, call for a profound renewal within the Belgian Catholic Party, a change that would translate into a greater social commitment, breaking away from the traditional and somewhat stagnant lines of the party. Convinced that internal reform was possible, Degrelle attends the Congress of the Catholic Party in the city of Courtrai, in the northwest of the country, on November 2nd, 1935, accompanied by 300 young Rexists. His intention is boldly to denounce from there the situation of the party, and in particular the figure of a corrupt leader within it. Although he is denied the floor, Degrelle takes the podium, and his fiery speech inflames the young people present against the party leadership. This is a point of no return, a decisive moment in which Degrelle realizes that, despite the reformist spirit, collaboration with the so-called bourgeois right wing of the party was not the path to the true transformation he longed for, thus breaking with the Belgian Catholic Party. This event, known as the Courtrai coup, is seen as the beginning of the so-called Rexist movement, named after the publishing house and newspaper from which Degrelle had raised his voice. 3 weeks later, a response to these events comes from the Belgian Cardinal Joseph van Rooij. This response is an open challenge against the Rexists, as it decrees the prohibition of priests participating in the activities of the Rexist movement and urges to stop its rise. This situation, far from discouraging Degrelle, fuels his fighting spirit and leads him to refine his political movement. Immediately after the Courtrai coup, Degrelle organizes his closest collaborators with unwavering determination. Thus, for example, Victor Mattis shapes the so-called propaganda units, while John Denis and José Strel develop the movement's programs and doctrinal foundations, laying the foundations for a clear vision of Belgium's future from the Rexist perspective. Thus, the entire machinery of the emerging movement is set in motion. A group of young people barely in their 20s set themselves the goal of creating a countercurrent political party, a true challenge that they embrace with enthusiasm. In this sense, given the impossibility of remaining in the Catholic Party due to their reformist intentions, the definitive break between the Catholic Party and Degrelle and his followers is formalized on the 21st of 1936, when the Rex Party, or Rexist Party, is officially founded. From this moment on, the name Rex. It ceases to be a publishing house or youth pressure group within the Catholic Party and becomes a true political entity, independent and organized with aspirations to power. In Belgium, most of the youth leaders of the Catholic Party who collaborated with Rex followed Degrelle in this new venture. On February 23, Degrelle organizes a large public rally in Namur, in the center of Belgium, bringing together about 5,000 young people. There, with palpable enthusiasm, he publicly presents the program that promises to regenerate the public life of Belgium. According to the testimony of several people present, at that moment it felt in the air that something new was beginning to take shape. Soon, preparations begin for the first electoral contest that the Young Rex Party will face. These being the general elections of May 24, 1936, in which the seats of both the Senate and the Chamber of Representatives of Belgium are contested. Despite being a new and relatively small party, especially compared to the Labour, Liberal, and Catholic parties, which it had recently split from, the Rex Party enters the Grelle arena, begins recruiting candidates, and organizes militants in every Belgian town. Within a matter of weeks, everything was ready. The party's campaign was frantic, with Rexist propaganda covering every corner of Belgium. And with Degrelle giving up to 12 rallies in a single day, it is at these rallies where Degrelle's extraordinary gifts as an orator and leader are displayed. He was able to keep the audience on the edge of their seats for hours, bringing his message of social revolution to every corner throughout Belgium. At the same time, the opposition press, especially the new newspaper called Real Country, became a constant vehicle for this popular and youthful fervor. When election day arrived, no one believed in the Resista Party, but soon the voting results exceeded the expectations of both supporters and detractors. A resounding success for Rexism, which won 21 deputies and 12 senators, equivalent to 11.49% of the total votes in the country. The victory was especially remarkable in the southern provinces of Belgium, where in certain areas it surpassed 30% of the votes, sweeping away the traditional parties and establishing itself as a rising party in the country. From that moment on, Rex began to establish itself as a fully consolidated party, expanding the so-called Rex Popular Front. It creates powerful corporate unions, expands its youth sections, and opens local headquarters throughout the country. After its notorious emergence in Belgian politics, the REX movement organizes itself with unbreakable energy, surpassing all initial expectations. Its members actively participate in every national debate, from minor strikes to corruption allegations, playing leading roles in eloquent moments, like the time when the Rexist seats appeared before Parliament with brooms, calling for the country to be cleaned up, contributing to the party's popularity and growth. In 1936, the figure of Grelle shines throughout Europe, being received by monarchs and international leaders, reflecting the resonance of that bold message. At the same time, the signing of a significant cooperation agreement with the Nationalists of Flanders, a territorial and cultural region that, together with Wallonia, makes up the Belgian nation. It further strengthens his position, making Degrelle believe he was on the verge of power. Regarding the party's ideology, Leon Degrelle loudly declared, "We have never been left or right. For us, a country is not half of its population fiercely fighting against the other half, locally stirred up by rival parties. A country is a nation, isn't it? The two components of a representative body, asleep for 4 years and then awakened by 3 weeks of fierce political campaigns." Starting in 1937, the Rexist movement began a phase of profound evolution toward fascist principles, which was a movement that originated as a third way between socialism and capitalism, and which, with substantial differences in each country, was becoming popular throughout Europe. The culmination of this evolution is manifested at the Lombeck Notre Dame Congress in July 1938, where more than 60,000 members and supporters gathered in an unprecedented political event in Belgium. It was unmistakably the beginning of a new era. Degrelle, dressed in a black uniform, appears before an audience filled with fervor, with flags waving and speeches echoing from a podium decorated with nationalist symbols, reminiscent of the great congresses of National Socialist Germany of that time. This display indirectly symbolizes the clear ideological affinity that Degrelle had developed, marking the beginning of his controversial and contentious relationship with the German Third Reich. After a long political career and activity during the 1920s, the politician and war veteran Adolf Hitler consolidates his rise, and that of his party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, as he became the head of government of Germany on January 30, 1933, beginning what has become known as the Third Reich. About Hitler's rise to power, we have a fascinating video on our channel, which we invite you to watch as we tell the story of that unique process without embellishment. Returning to Degrelle, he seeks to ally himself with other European movements of the so-called third position to achieve what he considered a better alternative for the future of the continent, different from the traditional dichotomies, such as left and right, liberals and conservatives, and capitalists and socialists. Thus, also fascinated by the rapid rise of the National Socialists, Degrelle begins to approach that party. This approach, with opinions both for and against, is not seen by the majority of his followers as a surrender of principles, but rather as a natural evolution, a step forward in social positions and in the political views of that time. In this sense, Degrelle begins, for example, with the Rexist Party, a critical component toward the concept of the Jewish religion and Jewish communities in Europe, an ideological position that, in the context of the time, was already being fervently promoted by the German National Socialist regime. This ideological convergence between Rexism and National Socialism, especially from 1937 onward, is what cements a solid alliance between Belgium and Germany's interests. A nation that, after years of crisis, was emerging as a true economic and military power, making traditional powers like the United Kingdom and France uncomfortable. At the same time, for Rexism, this closeness with Germany was not just a matter of ideological support, but also translated into crucial financial and logistical assistance from the Third Reich. For Rexism, which, let's remember, despite its recent victory in the 1936 elections, did not hold all political power in Belgium, but only a small part. However, it's important to point out that National Socialism was not the only third position movement with which Rexism had a close relationship, because as we mentioned, during this same period, several nationalist movements were rising up across Europe to bring about what they felt and understood as the construction of the Europe of United Homelands, a new era for the continent that challenged the established order and that they saw as the path toward the regeneration and splendor of Europe's future. In this sense, Degrelle also maintained relations with the Spanish Falange of the Hispanic organization of the National Syndicalist, the late José Antonio Primo de Rivera, with Benito Mussolini's National Fascist Party, and with Cornelio Codreanu's Iron Guard. However, returning to the Third Reich while all this is happening, one of the most crucial events soon occurs, not only in the path of Degrelle and Rexism, but for all of Europe. This is the beginning of the Second World War. On September 1, 1939, when Germany invades Poland, unleashing what would eventually become one of the bloodiest conflicts in all of human history. Shortly after, on May 10, 1940, the Germans began the invasion of Belgium, a nation that, however, had declared itself neutral in the world conflict. Until then, Belgium had a parliamentary constitutional monarchy presided over by King Leopold III, who was a somewhat more symbolic figure with limited power, and by the Prime Minister, Hubert Pirlo, elected by Parliament, and in whom the executive power rested. However, when the German operations began, the weak Belgian army was able to offer little resistance against the powerful German army, which is why the country ended up being definitively occupied by the Germans. On May 28, 1940, that same day, King Leopold III surrendered to the Germans, and the administration of the territory of Belgium was placed under the direct military authority of the German armed forces, with the assistance of the Belgian public administration, which chose limited cooperation to minimize the damage in this regard, with a fully occupied Belgium within the framework of the alliance between the Third Reich and the Rexist Party. And after the so-called Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, with which Germany began the invasion of the Soviet Union. 2 Belgian military units were created known as the Walloon Legion, initially attached to the German army and later to the SS, and the Flemish Legion, which always remained attached to the SS. These legions, which came to include between 15,000 and 18,000 Belgian volunteers, had the main objective of providing all kinds of support to the German army on the so-called Eastern Front, stopping the advance of Soviet troops. Degrelle, who was the visible face of the relationship between the Third Reich and Rexism, performed notably in the Walloon Legion, even though Degrelle had no previous military experience. He initially enlisted as a corporal and soon rose through the ranks thanks to his merits in combat. Thus, he was appointed lieutenant after receiving the Iron Cross in 1942, and when the Walloon Legion became an assault brigade attached to the SS. In 1943, Degrelle held the rank of commander, formally taking direct command of a military unit. Thus, he actively participated in the main battles of the Legion, such as the Battle of Korsun-Cherkasy in 1944, where he stood out for his leadership in extreme situations and survived the annihilation of numerous officers. In fact, surprisingly, Degrelle became the most decorated non-German during the entire World War. He received distinctions such as the already mentioned Iron Cross, the German Cross in Gold, and the Nacham Spain's Medal, awarded to those outstanding soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. Grelle's personal commitment on the front lines and his extraordinary dedication to his cause did not go unnoticed by the leadership of the Third Reich. He soon developed a personal relationship and a deep admiration with Adolf Hitler, who once, when decorating him, said, "If I had a son, I would want him to be like you." This relationship with Hitler, along with his closeness to Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS. And we also have an interesting video about him on our channel, which places him in a privileged circle within the German hierarchy. These personal interactions not only gave him support and recognition, but also solidified his conviction that he was on the right path, according to his own words, working side by side with the architects of a Europe that, in his vision, was destined for greatness and a profound social and spiritual transformation. For Degrelle, these years of combat were the synthesis of a period of intense dedication and unbreakable faith, which he considered as the building of a better future for the entire European continent. A time that would soon end, unfortunately for Degrelle and his legionnaires. Goodbye. As the so-called Allied forces were defeating Germany on all its fronts, León, Grelle, and the units he served with found themselves in an increasingly difficult situation. In this final period of World War II, the Belgian legions remained under conditions of extreme adversity. This was a testament to their proven discipline and perseverance of character, even knowing they were on the losing side. This is a time when Degrelle and the Belgians make a strategic reassessment and confront the reality of a conflict that had taken a definitive course. Faced with the final collapse of the Third Reich and the dissolution of power structures, in April 1945, Degrelle, aware of the legal and political implications of his position, undertakes an escape by land to Norway, which was still controlled by the Third Reich and had not yet capitulated. His escape soon becomes a high-risk operation designed to avoid possible capture and prosecution. The escape, carried out across a continent in ruins, proves successful and allows Degrelle to evade immediate justice, opening a new chapter in his life, marked by secrecy and later by exile. As soon as Degrelle arrives in Oslo, Norway surrenders to the Allies, which forces Degrelle to find a way to keep escaping. He finds the opportunity to escape in a plane provided by Josef Terboven, a German official in Norway, who would commit suicide a few hours after giving him that plane. Thus, Degrelle manages to barely make it across all of Europe and arrives at the beaches of San Sebastian in the northwest of France, just as the plane's fuel had run out, causing the aircraft to crash on La Concha Beach, which gave the locals a scene worthy of an action movie. Degrelle and the rest of the crew are rescued alive and taken to the nearest hospital. Meanwhile, his family, who had stayed in Belgium after the end of the war, is detained by the Allied forces. Even his own wife, Marie-Paul Lemay, would spend many years imprisoned along with his parents, elderly. They are imprisoned solely for being related to Degrelle, dying in prison, and at an advanced age. In fact, Degrelle himself is also tried in Belgium. As soon as the World War ends, he is accused of collaborating with the Third Reich, but not for war crimes, as is commonly believed, being sentenced to death in December 1944. However, Degrelle will not serve this sentence because he is abroad. Back in Spain, the newly arrived Degrelle tries to stay away from the press and keep his identity a secret. Despite this, British intelligence manages to infiltrate Spain and discovers that Degrelle was living there. As a result, the Allies immediately demand his extradition, which is denied time and again by Francisco Franco's government, which protects him and grants him political asylum in Spain, a legal prerogative that would protect him until the end of his life. Thus, Degrelle, facing more hardship than glory, evades justice and lives in his new homeland. Renouncing the life of that exciting drive for renewal of his younger years and abandoning the Rexist movement, which had been permanently dissolved on March 30, 1945, in Belgium. During his first years in Spain, members of the Spanish Phalange helped Degrelle hide his identity and start a new life in Andalusia. There, he reunites with his wife and children and starts several businesses, becoming the owner of a real estate agency, which built the houses for a United States military base in Spain. Over time, Degrelle changes his name to José León Ramírez Reina, although his closest neighbors know him as Don Juan de la Carlina. In 1954, he receives Spanish citizenship, and in 1958, his wife asks him for a divorce. By the late 1960s, there was no longer any danger of him being extradited or kidnapped by various international intelligence agencies. Well, as we saw by this time, Degrelle, who was already approaching 63 years old, was already a Spanish citizen, and the Belgian state had publicly recognized that Degrelle was in fact a foreigner by revoking his Belgian nationality, thus avoiding having to serve the original 1944 sentence. During his long exile in Spain, Degrelle did not adopt a life of retirement. On the contrary, he remained intellectually active and devoted himself to writing works, which from his perspective sought to reinterpret the historical events of the Second World War. It was during this period that Degrelle became a prominent figure in promoting what is known as denialism, a stance that denies, with its own arguments, several of the most controversial acts attributed to the Third Reich during the Second World War. In this way, Degrelle publishes and spreads theses that challenge the narrative established by the victors about the war crimes committed by Germany, focusing on presenting an alternative version of history. In general, the Spanish exile becomes a meeting point for various individuals and groups who shared or sympathized with ideologies linked to National Socialism and the post-war third position. In this sense, Degrelle establishes and maintains close ties with these individuals, being a central figure in the articulation of this revisionist thinking about the events of the Second World War. A prominent example of these connections was his close relationship with the Spanish Circle of Friends of Europe, known by its acronym as Círculo Español de Amigos de Europa, founded in 1966. Very soon, Círculo Español de Amigos de Europa became the second largest National Socialist organization in history, after the now defunct National Socialist German Workers' Party itself. They dedicated themselves to spreading these ideas and found in Degrelle a charismatic speaker and role model. This interaction allows Degrelle to continue influencing the ideological sphere of the third position, despite his formal political isolation. However, Grelle's presence in Spain is not limited to writing or closed articles. Through his publications and his contacts, he exerts considerable influence over the new generations and figures who are interested in these currents of thought. A notable case was his relationship with Pedro Varela, a bookseller, president of Cidade, and owner of what was once the Europa bookstore, which became a key distributor of his works and of the ideas associated with historical revisionism and National Socialism, until its closure by court order in 2016. Going back to Degrelle, throughout his nearly 5 decades in Spain, he never stopped his propaganda efforts, despite the condemnations and international ostracism. He managed to maintain a network of publications and contacts that allowed him to continue spreading his ideas. Even after the death of General Francisco Franco in 1975 and the return of party democracy in 1978, goodbye. In this sense, since the late 1970s and early 1980s, he has written and published numerous books and articles that are distributed clandestinely or semi-clandestinely through networks with Cidade. This persistence in communication was fundamental to keeping his version of history and his ideological principles alive, serving as an inspiration for those who shared his worldview. Despite his advanced age and the legal prohibitions, León Degrelle continues to be During this period in the 1980s, an active figure in activism in Spain, which was stirred by the return of party democracy. He takes part in rallies, conferences, and various public activities that allow him to connect directly with new followers and supporters. His charisma, eloquence, and the firmness of his convictions, which he had demonstrated since his youth, they continue to attract people interested in his ideas, earning the loyalty and support of those who saw in him a true role model in his later years. A specific event from the last years of Grelle occurred in 1985 when León Degrelle was the subject of a legal process in Spain as a result of some statements he made that were published in Tiempo magazine and later broadcast on television, in which he denied the truth of certain aspects of the Holocaust during the World War II. The lawsuit was filed by Violeta Friedman, a practitioner of the Jewish religion and of Romanian nationality. Initially, the courts ruled in favor of Grelle, citing the right to freedom of expression. However, due to the controversial nature of the matter, the case reached the Constitutional Court of Spain, which issued a significant conclusion. The court ruled that while freedom of expression may protect the publication of falsehoods or distortions of historical facts, in this particular case, Grelle's statements constituted a serious affront to the dignity of the victims and those affected. Consequently, the court sentences Degrelle to pay a considerable financial fine. Nevertheless, this sentence does not prevent Degrelle from continuing to maintain a public presence in certain circles, like Cidade, as he continues to appear at gatherings of ultra-nationalist groups throughout Europe. He was even the guest of honor at a rally organized in Madrid by Cidade in commemoration of the centenary of Adolf Hitler's birth, held on April 20, 1989. These events demonstrate his persistence in the public sphere and his ability to remain a reference for certain ideological groups, even after his judicial conviction for his denialism. However, by the late 1980s and early 1990s, the health of the energetic Degrelle begins to decline progressively, until finally Degrelle dies. On March 31, 1994, at 11:30 p.m., as a result of a cardiac arrest caused by acute pulmonary edema. His final resting place was a private clinic in the city of Malaga. After his death, his friends, comrades, and family organized masses, funerals, and memorials in Madrid and Barcelona. However, some members of the church, including the Bishop of Malaga, refused to hold any mass in his honor. Despite having been a faithful and fervent practicing Catholic throughout his life, the figure of León Degrelle stands as a complex and controversial chapter in the history of the 20th century, marked by his unwavering adherence to a rather particular and alternative vision of the world. From his energetic youth activism to his role in collaboration and his prolonged exile. Overall, his political and military career reflects both the ideological fervor that drove him and the political, judicial, and moral consequences he faced for his collaboration with the National Socialist regime. Ultimately, the life of León Degrelle illustrates how loyalty to a cause can lead to glory for some and condemnation for others, placing him in an ambiguous place between myth and infamy. His journey from political prominence to exile in Spain sums up the ideological and moral tensions that marked Europe during and after World War II. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe, activate the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and share it with your friends through social networks like WhatsApp or Facebook. This way, you help us a lot to reach new people and keep producing this material. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart for following and supporting us, and we'll see you next time.